Welcome to the Mayor Commission work session, which was almost something else. But anyway, it is July 6, 2021, and it is 10:02 a.m. By the way, the President did text me. He has a family situation, so he won't be able to make it today. So it'll just be me and all of you. All right, and I'm delighted. Okay, first item on the agenda, naming rights, follow-up discussion. Madam City Attorney.
Good morning, Mayor, members of the Commission. It's my pleasure this morning to present to you some of the research that our office undertook based on direction given by the Commission to look at the possibility for additional revenue-generating opportunities for the city. So I figured we would start with what we have currently in place. And if you are aware or not aware, we have a Parks and Recreation Advisory Committee. And that committee actually has implemented and adopted rules and naming policies as it relates to parks and park facilities, park property. Their rules that were adopted apply to all parks, facilities, major features within the park. It requires a written request by someone looking for a naming or renaming opportunity. PRAC will receive, review, and recommend approval of the naming request to the Commission. The Commission will ultimately decide. I haven't seen one of them come up in my tenure. It could have happened, but they do have some rules established that is a nice starting point or guidelines for other rules you may wish to adopt formally by the Commission. We also do naming by contract. An example is the library. So the Mandel Library created a 501c3 organization whose task was to raise funds to help with the construction of the library and other things. So in the agreement, the foundation has the ability to take requests, or naming rights requests. The requirements are that the rights would be in perpetuity to the individual or entity requesting the naming rights. There is a $100,000 minimum donation that can be paid over a 10-year period. It's ratified, the naming opportunities are ratified by the Commission. The funds are placed specifically into the library fund for the library purposes, and there's a monthly report on those fundraising activities to the city administration. So that's what we currently have in place. So we looked at a number of local government entities, both inside the state and outside the state of Florida. This presentation focuses on some of our neighboring communities and what they have in place. The first code that we're going to look at is the Miami-Dade County Code. It has a marketing partnership program, which really focuses more on sponsorship agreements. The city too does sponsorships for events, but their sponsorship program, much like ours, gives the third-party commercial vendor the opportunity to market in exchange for money or in-kind services. Their mayor has the authority to approve these agreements without bringing it to the Commission if they're under $1 million and they're event related. Non-event related agreements over $1 million and non-event related agreements at all come to the Commission for approval. Then Miami Beach, we also looked at their ordinance. They have an ordinance in place that gives some parameters for naming rights for public facilities, monuments, and memorials. It applies to all facilities located in and owned by the city. The requests are reviewed by a committee. They look at all of the terms that are proposed, including monetary terms and conditions. They make recommendations to the Commission. The Commission approval requires a supermajority. And if it's an external or exterior public facility and it's to be named after someone who is living, the person has to be more than 100 years of age. If they're less than 100 years of age, there's some other requirements, and it also requires to go to referendum by vote of the community. Broward County Code of Ordinances also has ordinance provisions about naming rights for its property. Again, it's a written request, shouldn't be named after living persons. There's a 90-day waiting period following the death of someone. If it's an organization, there are some factors that they can consider in deciding whether or not that organization should be used. If it's named after a person, it has to be published on an agenda. That is at least 1 month before the naming rights are actually approved. They also take community input, and their regulations are not applicable to naming rights that are sold by agreement. Obviously, similar to our agreements, those agreements would come specifically to the commission for approval. So Wilton Manor also established a policy, but that policy was adopted by resolution. It applies to all of its amenities, buildings, parks, streets, recreational areas, and facilities. You have to forgive me for reading because I can't remember all of their terms and conditions without reading to it. So the applications are submitted directly to the city manager there in Wilton Manors. The manager reviews it for completeness and documentation. If it's to be named after a person who is deceased, there's also a request or a requirement that the next of kin approve the request. There is input by the public at 2 separate commission meetings. The commission approval is by resolution only. The commission may also negotiate agreements memorializing terms and conditions relating to the granting of naming rights. And the commission has final approval and an absolute discretion to grant or deny for any reason or no reason at all requests. Pinellas County also adopted their policies by resolution. They have a series of resolutions. There's 3 of them. One that looks at honorary naming rights, philanthropic naming rights, and also corporate naming rights. So in their guidelines, they specifically identify sponsorship agreements where they permit third parties to come in again. Those parties can have the right to name an asset or a venue, and they're sold for either a cash or in-kind contributions. The honorary naming rights also require commission approval. Generally, they come with no monetary consideration. The philanthropic naming rights require a submission of an individual naming rights plan so that they outline what the plan is for the naming rights. It also would include a requirement that there is a committee that looks at the plan and that is then recommended to and approved by the commission by resolution. St. Petersburg has a very small ordinance section. It applies to the naming of all lands. Anything that's named in St. Petersburg is named and approved by ordinance, and it's included in their ordinances. They also have a stipulation that their namings cannot be named after a living person unless that person has made exceptional contributions for a specific purpose or a project, or similarly to probably like our Curry Park donation of land, it was a stipulation in the donation that the property be named after the donor.
Madam City Attorney, what is a geographic feather?
Features.
Oh, features.
And that is
I didn't know if it's
a
special bird or
typographical
something.
error.
Okay, so it's geographic features.
Yes.
Okay.
Unpicked up by my reading eyes and by spell check because it is spelled correctly, and for that I apologize.
No, it's
to you
okay.
and to the board.
I didn't know what it was. It's not a thing. It's okay.
I didn't click through fast enough for you to get your eyes off of that
sorry.
error. I apologize. So those are the main ordinances and resolutions by various communities in the state of Florida that we looked at. We also, as I said, looked at some across in California, Savannah, Georgia, and others that could give us some additional considerations in drafting if that's the will of this body. some considerations that you will want to think about. Who is eligible for acquiring naming rights? Are we going to regulate as to honorary, corporate, or philanthropic naming rights endeavors? When we look at the city of West Palm Beach, certainly we have on a case-by-case basis done some of those philanthropic naming rights through the Grassy Waters Conservancy and through the Mandel Public Library. We'll also want to look at what fees should be charged. Is there an application fee? Are there specific naming rights opportunities fees for various things? And I'll give you an example. This was a chart that was used in one of the out-of-state entities that we looked at, and as you can see, they went through and they identified what are the facilities, the amenities, where they located, what would be the range of fees they would want to charge for those, the naming rights lasting from 5 years through 20 years with escalating fees attributable to the amount of time that the name remained. We'd also want to find out, well, which properties should be included, much like the slide we just looked at. Is it parks, streets, programs or events, facilities, the interior or exterior structures like plazas, courtyards, gardens, lobbies, programs and meeting rooms. We would also want to consider when would the naming opportunities arise and under what conditions? Do you want it to be living, non-living? What are the parameters? Is it construction of new city facilities only? Renaming of existing facilities, programs, and events? Or naming and non-naming of existing city facilities, programs, or events? And with that, we're looking for a direction as to what actions you wish for us to take as it relates to a formal naming rights policy, if any. And based on that direction, we'll look at best path to move forward and do an additional presentation of proposed changes, or creation, actually, of an ordinance that regulates naming rights.
Thank you, Madam City Attorney. And if I recall correctly, I think Commissioner Fox, you were kind of the one who was wanted this discussion. So any comments you want to make related to your interest in this?
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much for that presentation. That was very thorough and interesting to see what the our neighboring cities are doing. I guess my first question is, I think in one of the first slides you mentioned that our parks program already has something like this in place. I don't remember if you told us if there were any guidelines that they have that they're following in terms of corporate or philanthropic or any other parameters that they already have in place.
They're really more of an, I will, following this meeting, send you a copy of what was adopted by that body and what guidelines they look at if there is a request that comes in. As I said, I don't, as I stand here, recall a specific time that they actually brought forward a recommendation. Oh, Leah.
Good morning, Leah Rockwell, Director of Parks and Rec. So we have had a couple, probably not since Kimberly's been here, where we've had the community come forward and request for an element in a park to be named after them. For instance, there's a gazebo at Chillingworth Park that the community came to PRAC and requested because that individual was a community leader for years, and they wanted to make sure that they had something in the park named after them. So there is a small gazebo at Chillingworth Park that is named after that individual. So typically it's the community coming to us and asking to have elements. And because we had so many people asking us years ago, we had to come up with some sort of guideline in which to work within. Otherwise, we'd have, things named after people that have since we would not have wanted things to be named after. So we wanted to make sure that we had a very clear policy in the Parks and Rec Advisory Committee of how we could go about naming things after them. So does that kind of answer your question? People generally come to us. I can tell you that, for instance, we have one of our parks that is currently about to undergo renovations through the bond and hopefully with some additional funding from the CRA and in partnership with the Housing Authority. And the park is named after a foundation or a family foundation that their contract with the city is about to sunset. So we would like to go and ask them if they would like the park to be continued to be named after their foundation and the family, and if so, that they would have to come back with some, yes, exactly, Mayor, with some money to have it named after them again, and in today's dollars, not in the dollars from 1998-ish. So we're going to be working on that. So instead of renaming the park, we'd like to go to them first and ask them if they'd like to continue their contract with the city to have it named after the family. And if not, then we would then come to this board and figure out where we'll go from there.
Do you have a follow-up, Commissioner?
Thank you. Well, Leah, I was wondering do you have any concerns, I guess, about moving forward with any renaming of parks, or are there some areas of parks like the one you're talking about that you think would be good examples for us to look at moving forward that might also, we could identify as looking for a sponsor or a philanthropic partner to work with?
Certainly there's opportunities out there. I do believe there are some opportunities, but many of our parks are named after individuals who have either donated land or who have served in a significant role in creating the city or the park system. So there might be elements within those parks that we could use, do some naming rights, but to change the names, I think we would really have to go to the community and ask them how they feel, and Parks and Rec Advisory Committee, before we would go down that road. Because, for instance, Phipps Park was named after the Phipps family that donated that land to the city. So to change that would require, I think, some, maybe the skate park would have a different name or something like that. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Good.
Mayor, can I make a quick clarification on
Absolutely.
something? I just want to clarify, because some of these ordinances that we saw that our city attorney presented combine naming rights with historical designations and so forth. We do have, and we just recently updated our Art Life West Palm Beach ordinance, which included the process for naming, whether it's a park or whatever, after historical figures. So that's a totally different process. I just wanted to clarify that.
Okay. Commissioner Schoaf and then Commissioner Warren, I think.
Thank you, Mayor. Two questions. One, I'm supportive of moving this forward and getting some parameters around it. As part of that process, do we have a process for what could potentially happen down the line if we felt there was a need for a removal or reimbursement? Example from the private sector within our city, there's a certain plaza that recently removed its name because it was no longer warranted by the residents of that building. So in that same structure, if we were to accept a sponsorship, in essence, a 20-year sponsorship, and 10 years down the line, for whatever reason, in the public opinion had shifted about that specific entity, do we have a process for removal and or reimbursement of those monies to those parties if we chose to decertify them?
In the agreements that we would draft and create that would be blessed at the same time as the regulations, generally speaking, we would include the parameters that would be appropriate for removal if a condition warranted the removal, and what those parameters would be. It would be included within the agreement, because obviously each individual naming would come with an agreement, either a sponsorship or otherwise, whatever the appropriate agreement was for that transaction.
Okay, so we would have a mechanism under certain conditions to be able to.
And we would probably include some of those broader categories of automatic right to withdraw in the ordinance itself. And let's say, for example, we decide that we're going to allow living people to be naming rights to living people if they made significant contributions, and at the time it was a perfectly appropriate person from all that we knew. Fast forward 10 years, they're convicted of some crime. We would want to include some automatic right to remove those living persons' naming rights that were associated with the agreements in that event. So we will have some automatic removal rights in the documentation that's signed and in the ordinance that's adopted.
Great, thank you. I want to just make sure we were protected from that point of view. My second question is there a mechanism that we can put into our resolution or our ordinance that would help create equity in this process? So having sponsorship funds is typically excess funds that aren't needed for daily operations of business, et cetera. So it's about an access to capital. And what it typically does is excludes Hispanic and communities of color from being able to contribute and have equal representation. And I think it's really important in a community like West Palm Beach that is extremely diverse to create those mechanisms so that we don't allow a disparity in this process. So if there's a mechanism that we can use, and I don't know what that is, I don't know if others have that, or if it came up anywhere in your research, that allows us to have a program that ensures that we are allowing equitable access and creating those opportunities for communities of color.
I can tell you that in looking at the regulations that are on the books, they've been on the books for some time, so there are not specific equitable components contained within the regulations that we've reviewed, but certainly we can look at if there's been regulations that are adopted in other areas that can transfer to a program like this that could be used, and I'm certainly willing to sit down with you and see if you have some specific ideas as well that we could work with, but we'll look for other examples in other areas that might work for this program as well.
Thank you. And Mayor, perhaps it's a topic for a subcommittee on your equity task force that may be able to contribute some ideas to that as well to try to make sure that we're creating that equitable process. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Warren?
Thank you. I think those were great points, Commissioner Shelf. As it relates to the process, Leah, you stated that the community comes to us. And is there a application and a process that is available for people to review in the event that they're considering that?
They typically provide us with a letter, and they have to give us a reason, and then they come and present to the Parks and Rec Advisory Committee why they feel that individuals' names should be, for instance, the Addie Green Hall, or that's bad. Let's go with the, because she gave us the money to build the building. The McDonald Wilson Center, the Mary McDonald Wilson Center. So the community came to us and said we would like the building to be named after Mary McDonald Wilson because this is why. And they gave a litany of reasons as to what she did in the community, and in particular in that neighborhood, and for the growth of the youth in the community. So they come to us, they do a presentation, and then the committee makes the decision. So that's how it's been done, not necessarily an application, but certainly an application would be a cleaner way for us to go forward. And I also wanted to just address the equity issue. When we name rooms or buildings after people from the community, it has in the past not been a commercial or a fundraising opportunity for the city or cash. It's just as a thank you to the family and to recognize the individual for the future. Just like the sickle cell, the naming of that building would be considered, or the community hub, yes, would be considered. So it's really based on doing the right thing for the community and acknowledging that individual. Like Jimmy Doc Horn, the tennis center was named after him.
And in my view, I would not want for us to use this as an emphasis on fundraising. I don't want to create the perception of West Palm Beach is for sale, or bits and pieces of West Palm Beach is for sale. So I'd be more interested in coming up with a program that recognized significant contributions from individuals. And I like the focus on either if they're living, they're over 100, or somebody's already passed, because I think that minimizes the chance that something will come out later that might embarrass the city. And I agree with Commissioner Schoaf that there should always be an interest in making this an equitable effort. Just some thoughts. Did you have follow-up?
No, it was really just to say that I believe that an application process that would be very clear and clean and would show criteria, and in that we can build in that that a letter is a part of the application process.
And if we were creating a program that actually specified how naming rights are awarded or assigned, I can tell you that we would want to have a very specific application process. I can tell you that some of the examples that we looked at included not only the public as applicants, but also provided a means for either commissioners, the mayor, or other elected officials to propose naming opportunities as well. And the second point that was raised about not just being monetary sale of city lands and property, that's the whole basis for the portion of the honorary naming rights, to honor someone based on their contributions and that type of thing. So you would want to include the honorary prong and what that looks like and how that is accomplished as well, in addition to the selling.
So for the honorary prong, we do have the criteria. That actually, we do have an application process and a criteria in place within our Art and Public Places ordinance that was recently updated and included that new language in there. So they do have to be deceased under the existing ordinance.
Okay, Commissioner Lambert.
Thank you so much for the research and the presentation. I am definitely supportive of documenting the process because I do believe that that helps eliminate any disparities of individuals or groups of individuals who might not be aware of an unwritten policy or procedures. So regardless of if we move forward or not, I think that that would be nice to have and to publish and to make available to the public. I am definitely supportive of the honorary and the memorials ordinance that we already have in place. I think that that's great, and I'm appreciative that we don't charge for that. I don't think that we should. I think that's a great way to honor those individuals who have given so much to our city. But I am still interested in looking at if there are larger opportunities for the city to look into sponsorship or naming rights that could be sold if it is the will of this body. I'm not interested in nickel and diming the city. You know, the gazebo that Leah mentioned, clearly that's not something that I would think would need to be considered in this, but I don't know if there are other buildings or structures within our city, and maybe there's only a handful of them that we might look at this opportunity for. I believe that that was in the vein of which this conversation was originally started a year ago.
Okay. Commissioner Shelf.
Thank you, Mayor. I think we've had a number of discussions specifically surrounding Curry Park, of which Chen Moore, that's working on Curry Park, has some structure for Commissioner Lambert's suggestion of what others have done on those major things. I hear and feel what the mayor's saying, and I agree. We don't want to have West Palm Beach for sale, but also agree with Commissioner Lambert that if there are those strategic opportunities, I think that's really what it's about, is striking that balance. And I guess I offer up that I've heard in many conversations from Chen Moore that they have a structure in place, that they've seen what others have done, and maybe that's a basis to start to make sure we strike that balance and still fulfill the mayor's goals, make sure that we're in line with that, but also create some of those revenue opportunities, because those dollars go directly back into our parks and create a better park. So I guess I offer that up as a suggestion.
So along those lines, for instance, Dreer Park Neighborhood Association wants to put in that massive, beautiful, boundless playground for all. And in order to make that happen, it's a very, very expensive playground to install. And if they want to, they can, but they'd use up all of their bond money just basically on that playground. So if there was a corporation or somebody out there that wanted to have a boundless playground named after them in Dreer Park, certainly that's the type of element that I would see as an opportunity that we're talking about. And that's the type of opportunity that Chenmore is also looking at. So that kind of gives you a real-life example of something in a park that is more than the normal purchase of a playground. It's something bigger, better, greater, that if we had a naming right or a sponsor of that playground, we could build something extraordinary.
Well, I think a starting point would be to identify those particular opportunities so that at least at the time we came up with a policy, resolution, ordinance, whatever it is that we're going to put together, there is a discussion and an agreement as to the scope and the specific opportunities that were in mind by the policymakers at that time. And that can always be changed from commission to commission, but we at least have a sense and a healthy discussion and dialogue as to what we're talking about when it comes to that. Because again, I just don't want to get into a bunch of smaller types of things and, 25,000 here or 50,000 there. To me, it doesn't set the right tone. But there may be some more significant opportunities there that we could look at. Commissioner Fox.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention that since our last discussion on this issue, I've had several companies call me, and probably we all have, but one of them in particular was a company from Cleveland that Mark Parks had referenced to us in our last discussion. That was someone he worked with, and so they called. And so there are many other things that go along with some of the naming opportunities. For example, Coke and Pepsi partnerships in cities could be, in the millions of dollars of sponsorships each year. So I just wanted to mention that. I'm happy to share any of those contacts. Some of them also were suggesting that video screens, for example, if you drive by the Kravis Center in the last year, they have a video screen outside on Okeechobee that is, basically advertising their shows to come. But that why couldn't we also have things like that that could be, advertising our events, but also, if we have a road closure, but also we could be selling advertising there too. I just wanted to mention that there are other opportunities. When I first did bring this up last year, it was because we were having very difficult budget discussions, and I was thinking, I'm in the marketing business, so always looking for opportunities that we might be able to take advantage of. So I just wanted to mention that there are those other kind of things that kind of could go along with the naming opportunities, and I'm happy to share any contact info if you're interested.
And the other thing we got to consider, if we're going to be taking money from whether it's major corporations or major individuals who are still alive, and they may take at some point down the road some political positions that are inconsistent with some of the values of the city. And let's make sure that the process includes a monitoring, if you will, of their public views and some kind of, and I think this is what Commissioner Schoaf might have been getting to, some kind of out if we decide that, the money's not worth it. So I throw that out there as well, because these are very interesting political times in which we live, and sometimes those with a lot of money can try to throw their weight around, not only with naming rights, but in other areas that may be inconsistent with what we stand for as a city. So we need to make sure we have an out.
Thank you, Mayor. Noted.
Commissioner Lambert.
Thank you, Mayor. I wholeheartedly agree with that, and I think that that's important. We talk about what the values of our city are, and that these folks agree with that as well. A question, because we mentioned about parks and not charging and just doing this as an honorary, but what about events? Don't we offer sponsorship? Like I were the fireworks, or at least the stage sponsored this past weekend? And so do we have those criteria in place for those sponsorships?
We have sponsorship agreements that we enter into routinely for the events. I can tell you on 4th on Flagler, I did a quick survey of the sponsorship agreements that I saw. We had one with Burkhardt Construction, Billbone LP, H. Greg One, FPL, Sandy James Fine Foods, the Solid Waste Authority, the Town of Palm Beach, Discover Palm Beaches, and if I left anyone off, I apologize, but that was a quick view of the contracts that our office processed as sponsorship agreements for the 4th on Flagler. And Leah?
Yes, sure. So we have an individual that goes out and that secures our sponsorships. As city employees, we've been told that we cannot solicit for sponsors. So we have under contract an individual who goes out and she beats the streets. I mean, she goes and walks indoors and talks to everyone and says, hey, do you want to be a part of this? And it's the gamut from small business to big corporations. And for instance, this year's sponsorship, the money that we brought in for sponsorships actually paid for all the direct costs of the event. So the city isn't paying direct costs, they're just paying some of the indirect costs to do an event like 4th on Flagler. So we do have somebody who goes out there and beats the streets from, all the radio stations to the TV stations to the local businesses, local and national businesses. So we're very, very actively pursuing, or she is, sponsors from all gamuts. But I mean, if somebody wants to sponsor something, they call us and say, hey, we want to be a part of this. And she goes out and she has that first meeting, that whole meeting to try and see at what level they are interested in sponsoring. And sometimes it's in kind. If they don't have the cash, they can do some sort of in-kind sponsorship with us and still be included. So a small business might be able to provide a service to us and get an in-kind sponsorship and be included.
Okay, so, thank you, Mayor. So it sounds like we already have somewhat of this process in place for corporate sponsorships, but it's only related to events right now.
Currently, yes.
And do you, off the top of your head, have any idea of how much we bring in from that?
Oh, gosh. I can get that to you. I should know off the top of my head.
That's all right. And
if Mary was standing right next to me, she would tell me, and I don't want to give you a number that's incorrect.
No problem. If I could get the cash as well as the in-kind amount, that would be helpful.
It's substantial.
Yeah, sounds like it. Great, thank you.
A tangential issue, and I know we talked about this at some point when I was on the commission, is the formation of supportive foundations, like for our parks and stuff. Where are we on that? For example, you mentioned Curry Park or Dreher Park. Would it be possible for a foundation to be created? And I know they do it in other cities, where I think what's the park in New York, the High Line or something like that. They've got a whole foundation that supports the maintenance and stuff. So is that something we've looked at for any of our parks?
It's something that we've looked at for the entire park system as a whole. Okay. And I can only tell you that it is something that is high on my priority list, but I've been remiss and it kind of keeps falling down, but it needs to be very high on the list. And now with my new wonderful boss, Dr. Harris, I'm sure he can help me get there. But there's even a national organization for parks foundations to help us get to where we need to go to make it happen. And the community foundation that happens to be in West Palm Beach can help us also get there. So that's for the broad umbrella. For instance, Dreher Park itself is thinking about creating their own foundation. So they're working on that as well. So Chris Betancourt is also looking at possibly a foundation just for Curry Park. It has to be a substantial size park that would be able to support a foundation, because often foundations also need some funds to survive. So it's high on our priority list, Mayor.
Well, I would like to have these discussions kind of go parallel. Because as we're talking about whether it's sponsorships or naming rights, let's do it in the context if we're going to have a single foundation for all parks or a foundations for park specific. Let's make sure we're kind of walking down both paths at the same time to ensure that we're not at cross purposes.
And I agree. And one of my concerns about individual park foundations is the inequity, because there are some smaller parks that probably could use the support, but would not have the ability to have a foundation. That's why I think it was important to first go and look at an umbrella parks foundation.
That's fine. I mean, I just like to see what you all can come back with, and before we finalize this part of the discussion, see if we can weave that into it. Mr. Frost, you seem to be moving toward the podium. I take it you want to speak?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Jack Frost. About 10 or 12 years ago, there was a foundation that was set up, you're correct, and it was for all the parks and also the cemeteries, because there was thoughts that we could start doing cemetery tours similar to New Orleans. That started to get off the ground, and then it became very difficult to actually get people involved who were willing to go out and raise the money and the funds and to be able to manage it, and it just sort of went by the wayside.
Okay. Thank you for that historical information. Anything else on this particular topic? So I guess, the staff is looking for instruction. As I read the room, certainly continue to look at ways, but maybe see how the foundation discussion goes as well. Is that kind of, did I misstate that? I mean, I think there's interest in exploring it.
Mayor, would you like for us to come back and have another discussion as it relates to the, a report back on the foundation, together with reporting back with some of the scope of the identity of the facilities that might be subject to the naming rights
I
regulations,
think,
and have a further
let's try to
conversation on
hone
the
it down. I
parameters?
mean, I think there was a kind of a consensus that we like to at least see what specific types of opportunities might be there for naming. The big stuff, I think, is what we were talking about. So if maybe we could come up with a preliminary list. Also, to hear more about what plans, if any, there might be to continue the progress that was made with the creation of a system-wide park foundation.
And we also have, I still have all of the legal documents that really never were, I don't think they were officially filed with the state that we got the certificate for the foundation, but I have all the documents, I have the bylaws. All we will need is for people to actually be willing to serve, to create that board, because you have to have all of that before you can file. So when that happened, that Mr. Frost spoke about, the commission at the time brought forward some names of individuals that they felt would be good members or active members for a foundation. So if you know anybody out there that would be interested in helping us, because you have to have that board in order to file for your 501c3 as a foundation. So please, and it's a 501c something, but that would be very helpful if you know individuals out in the community that are movers and shakers that could make it happen more quickly.
Well, before we go there, let's kind of get a better sense as to what was contemplated, the mission of the foundation, what types of things could be covered by foundation expenses, maybe the ballpark budget or fundraising goal. Let's kind of make sure this group is on board with the direction in which you're headed before we start identifying names, because there may be some tweaking that we want
Absolutely. I would think so. It's been a while since those
Yeah.
documents were created.
And on that note, Madam City Attorney, we might need a refresher from you or Norm as to what role we as commissioners and mayor could play in soliciting funds for that foundation. I don't know if there are ethical restrictions, so that we know going into this what we can or can't do from a fundraising.
We'll make that part of the presentation.
Yeah.
It comes back to you.
If it's an official city foundation, I don't know. You guys tell us what we can do. Commissioners, is that kind of consistent with your understanding what next steps? Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.
All right. Now we'll have an update on our penny sales tax projects from Mr. Valbrecht.
Good morning, Mayor, Commissioners. Just let me get
Morning.
my slides up here real quick. Okay, so the sales tax program has been in effect since 2017. I'm going to give you a summary of the funding and how much we've spent and what's left, and then I can get further into the details of the projects that we've used the money for and what we have currently planned. The sales tax program, originally we planned it out where we're going to do it all in about 5 years. It's a 10-year program. We have to spend all the money, $60 million by 2027. And so the schedule sometimes is kind of fluid because we've been moving things out as our resources dictate what we can do at the current moment. But we have accomplished quite a bit, as you'll see. So, basically, the $60 million, it's a $60 million or 10 years, whichever comes first. We've currently collected about $31.3 million through the first quarter of this year. And there's a sales tax oversight committee that meets every quarter, and we go through all the details and updates of what's been going on. They ask questions and basically, so that we have somebody looking over our shoulder to make sure that what we're doing with the money is being fiscally prudent and with the intention that was derived when it was put together. We currently are getting a new member of the Sales Tax Oversight Committee, and so our next meeting we haven't actually scheduled yet, but we were going to have one in March that we did not. So I would anticipate in the next month or so we're going to have another Sales Tax Oversight Committee meeting. So it consists of 14 specific major projects, and some of those might be broken down into smaller projects because there's quite a bit of money that was just not entirely defined. One of those, the first one, is the Greenway and Multipurpose Pass project. That has an allocation of $2.54 million. We've expended $666,000 so far, and we have a remaining allocation of $1.873, of which we've committed that $1.873 to specific projects that we intend to use that money for, and I'll get into the details of those later. The citywide roadway improvements, that's the largest fund of the sales tax program. That was allotted $12.3 million, of which we've expended about $3.92. And we have other allocations of committed to various projects of $3.536 million, with a remaining allocation of $4.8, of which $418,000 of that we are allocating to other commitments since March of this year. So there's about $4.4 million of non-defined committed or non-committed money remaining in the original 12.3. And the makeup of the the $418,000, again, there's a number of projects that we use this for. Northmore Elementary, which is improvements down near the Northmore Elementary School, with about $120,000, which we're using for design. We'll eventually have to put some money in for doing the construction work. We're also doing school zone upgrades, which is phase 4, which is there's about 7 schools involved in that. We have a program where we're mandated by the state to upgrade all of the school zone safety facilities for the school zone, like flashing beacons, signage, striping, crosswalks, and things like that. And so we have used some of the citywide roadway improvements for school zone upgrades. We also did some work on Elizabeth Drive, where we have another $8,300 that we need to put in to final out that job. And then some money that we put in for Gregory Road at US 1. another $2,600. Some of the money for these projects was in that original $3.9 million that I mentioned that we spent already. And then the North Shore neighborhood, we have another $193,000 that we're putting into that project to take care of a lot of the additional changes and things like that that we did on that. Oops, didn't mean to do that. So the other projects are the Broadway Avenue improvements. That has an allocation of $5.461 million. We've expended about $150,000 on that, and that's mostly been done in study and planning. We have a remaining allocation of $5.3 million. And El Monte Park neighborhood, that has an allocation of 1.77, of which we've spent about $98,000 so far, with a remaining 1.671. And then Flamingo Park neighborhood is another neighborhood project, $3 million roughly. We spent about $86,000. We've been doing this design work somewhat in-house. We have a remaining allocation about $2.97 million to spend on that neighborhood. Parker Avenue improvements, which is down the south end of Parker, from Summit to Forest Hill. We have $6 million allotted towards that. We've spent about $203,000. So we still have $5.8 million. We also have some supplemental grant money from FDOT on this, which makes it about $8 million for the whole project. South Dixie improvements, that was allotted $3,050,000. We spent $73,000 in doing some study and planning on that. We have a $2.9 million remaining allocation on that. And that project currently is kind of like in limbo. I'll get into that a little bit later in the details. Coleman Park Community Center, we had $3.55 million allotted to that. We've spent $138,000. This is through March of this year. The remaining allocation of $3.411, we've already allocated that towards the design build contract to build that community center, and that is still in the design phase. Then we have the Gaines Park Community Center. That had $4.97 million allotted out of the sales tax program, of which we spent $264,000, mostly for doing the concept designs, remaining of $4.7 million, and then there's another $3 million towards that project in the Parks Bond program. Pleasant City Community Center, that was a $1.4 million allocation, of which we spent $189,000 through March. The other $1.23 million has also been committed and pretty much has been spent by now because we're almost completed with the renovations of Pleasant City Community Center. I expect that project will wrap up probably in another month or two. And then the Fire Police Training Facility, that had $7.1 million allocated. We've spent about $433,000, and a lot of that had to do with preparing the site where we currently have the temporary fire station 9. We also provided new water and utility services in conjunction with the county that was doing some improvements on Roebuck Road. So we've got the water main extended down so that we can provide water service to the future training facility, which is out by the ECR. And we still have about $6.7 million left in that allocation to eventually work on the training facility itself. Howard Park Community Center, another $4.97 million. We spent $60,000 roughly in doing concept designs. It's currently in a design competition with two firms who are putting together new concept designs that will be, they're going to turn those in like next week, and then they'll be setting up community meetings to go through those and eventually select one of the concept designs and go forward with that firm that had the one that was the winner. And this last slide, I know it's kind of small, but basically it's kind of like a cash flow diagram. You can see that the the salmon-colored line as of March of 2021. This shows what we're, based on the cash flow that we've assigned to our schedule. You can see that in 2021, we expect to have allocated or utilized $19.1 million of the money that we've collected so far. And then the lines down below, the actual revenue, you can show, it shows that we've collected the $31.3 million. And we anticipated it on a 10-year thing, which was basically $6 million a year. And we have collected more than that each year. The 2.227 number is what we had collected so far for 2021 through March. So,
Do we have a dip because of COVID in 2020 below our projections?
not necessarily. Other than just the normal slowdown of certain things, but we've actually been doing a lot of roadway work this past year in 2020 with sales tax money. So
No, in terms of actual revenues received.
yes, we did have a slowdown in revenues last year from what was previously done.
How far below the 6 million?
It was about $4.5 million.
Okay, but we expect that will rebound.
Yes, yes. And we, over the 10-year period, and I think the projections for this year are up again too, so.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm gonna go to some other slides
Commissioner
now.
Lambert has a question.
Okay.
Mr. Volberg, I think you may have skipped a slide. I don't know if you did it intentionally. The slide right before this one, did we see that one?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
My apologies.
Good
Yes,
eyes.
Palmetto Park improvements, that was a $444,000 project. We spent 45, and then the remaining 399. Most of that is also very close to being spent as well. And then the citywide lighting improvements, there was $2.54 million that was allotted towards that. And then we've spent $361,000 of that through March, and we have another $2.1 million to spend on lighting in the city. Let me go to the, this was that same graph that I showed you previously.
You'll make this PowerPoint available to the commissioners?
I will.
Thank you.
And this is basically what we go over with the sales tax committee when we meet with them. And then we have a specific schedule for all of the projects, and so we go through and we've forecasted when we're gonna do the projects. The ones that are in green are the ones that are done. And then, like for instance, on the Greenway Path, we've allotted $597,000 towards the Clear Lake Trail project, of which $287,000 is toward the design and another $310,000 towards that construction cost. I could go through these, but I don't know if you want to get into that level of detail. And basically, it lays out all of the projects. This shows the $4.8 million unallocated money from the citywide roadway improvements, the Broadway project, and it just gives basically all the details for the money that's going to be spent on those, or that's allocated for them, and how we plan on utilizing that. And I will share this with you electronically, unless you want me to go through anything specifically, I'd be glad to.
Commissioner Fox. I don't know if your mic is on.
I think it was maybe 2 slides before this, there was, in the roadway projects, I noticed that there is, Roosevelt Estates is listed there as completed. So I was just curious, I mean, in some of the 4.4 million, I don't know if you're going to talk about this later, but how do we determine with the 4.4 million that's not committed, how do we determine what that can be spent on?
Well, we did actually do 2 phases of Roosevelt Estates, and we spent several $100,000 so far on repaving parts of Roosevelt Estates. We have a current project that we're have a grant for on 7th Street. We have $572,000 allotted to cover our match for that grant out of the sales tax. And then there's another about $1.8 million of estimated paving work to do in that northeast section of Roosevelt Estates, which is, we're currently going to get ready to start our community engagement on that project with the community, with the assistance of JSA. And we hope to be able to, come to terms with that neighborhood and start working out there, in the next few months. And so this reflects the projects that we did previously from last year.
Mayor, if I could kind of
Yes.
clarify a little bit. So, Commissioner, to answer your question on the use of the funds, and that's an important question, and we just actually did a request for legal services to give us an opinion on unallocated funding or allocated funding to shift it to other priority projects. That can be done with the city commission approval. So the staff can come back to city commission with new projects or increased funding for other projects to be able to then reallocate either unallocated funding or even allocated funding that's in an existing project, move it to another one. So that can be done without having to go out to a referendum, even though these projects were listed, I believe, in the referendum that was approved by voters. You don't have to go back out to a voter referendum. And as an example, Kevin mentioned some issues with South Dixie Highway project. There's over $4 million allocated to that project. Because of the amount of community input that we got and that FDOT got, they really didn't want lane elimination in that area. That funding is sitting there, and if it is the will of this body to move that funding into another project, we can look at doing so. So those are the discussions that we really need to have. Fire police training, that's a project that I think could be expanded potentially to include, for example, we have a warehouse out in the warehouse district. We have our warehouse there, the city warehouse, and some other facilities that could also potentially go out west, and that would free up space in that area for potentially private development that we can then get revenues from as well. So there's things that we need to go over and consider about how to utilize this funding going forward.
All right, we'll have those discussions and come back with some more fine-tuned recommendations. Commissioner Lambert.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Volbrecht. So a couple questions here. So today's presentation is primarily on the financials and where we are, because I hear then, I had that same question that Commissioner Fox had. You mentioned 4.8 million unallocated under roadway improvements, and I clearly have some ideas on what that could be used for, but certainly understand that when this referendum passed, it was my understanding that there's a list of projects, we couldn't deviate from those. So today, we're not talking about that, but that is slated for another time. Is that correct?
Well, I can certainly go through those details if you'd like. I wanted to go through the financials of them. Of the $4.8 million, we have revenues that we utilize for roadway improvements. We have the gas tax and we have the sales tax, essentially. In the current priority paving list for next year, there's about $4.7 million of paving costs that are priorities based on PCIs or other synergies, such like Roosevelt Estates, for instance. So somehow between the sales tax money and the gas tax revenues, we're going to try to fund those projects appropriately. So even though it says there's $4.8 million, it isn't just like sitting there waiting to be used. There's a number of priorities that come up on a regular basis that we utilize this money for appropriately. And, I could share that information with you as well if you wanted to see that.
But the focus of this presentation is only on the progress of the penny sales tax projects.
Yeah.
All right, if you want to do a separate presentation at some point on road paving, priorities, and sources of funds, we could do that. But I don't want to convolute that discussion into this discussion. So let's focus on where we are with the status of the penny sales projects. And a question I have is, I thought at one point we were going to have a dashboard or something where the public could access this information, maybe not to this degree of detail, but kind of a 10,000-foot level as to where a particular project was. Is that happening?
Actually, that's included in our CIP website. We have that information on there now.
All right. Can we get word to the public that if they are interested, this is something that we went to the people for. So they should be able to monitor the city's progress without a lot of effort. So if there's some way of getting the information to the public that if you want information on the status of penny sales projects, this is where you go or something. so that we're being transparent as how we're using these monies.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mayor, we'll work with the communications department and get something
Please.
out. And I think our parks bond is a good example that we maybe can replicate some of what we're doing with our parks bond, which is very transparent and easy to
Right.
get to, so.
Well, let me just give you a quick summary of the various 14 projects, okay? Maybe that will be helpful. So on the Greenway multi-purpose paths projects, again, we've utilized some of the money. We built some trails in the parks. We have the money set aside for Clear Lake Trail to help with our match for the grant. The other money was, we had about $1.5 million that was allotted towards the Flagler Trail project. Now that project's basically being redefined, and so that money will probably need to get reallocated to something else. We do have other trails and multi-use paths that we anticipate to do. We have some money to spend on 26th Street. We may do something related to a Flagler Trail, but right now we're going to, it's just been allocated towards that until we fully redefine what we're gonna do. We're planning on just doing a paving project on Flagler to include bicycle lanes, and I may or may not be able to utilize some of this money for that, but hopefully we will be able to. And that's where the Greenway multi-use path money is currently being planned, how that's currently being planned to be used. On the citywide roadway improvements, I basically kind of elaborated on what we're doing with that, so I'm not going to reiterate that. On Broadway, the money that's allocated towards that, we're currently working with FDOT. We were going to do a lane repurposing project there similar to South Dixie. They have told us that they do not want us to do it that way, and we have come up with some alternatives that we think will work and we'll be able to keep that project going. We've been in a lot of discussions with the technical traffic staff from FDOT, as well as working with RISE to come up with some ideas on how we can incorporate the safety improvements with a complete streets aspects to it, and we are very actively involved with them together to try to salvage this project and make it be something that is going to be worth doing, because there's about $8 million of grant money associated with it on top of the $6 million that we have allocated in the sales tax. And so we're very, very diligently working on trying to come up with something on this Broadway job that's going to be a viable alternative that would be acceptable to all parties who are involved in that, the city as well as FDOT and the community. And so we're working again, like I said, with Craig Glover. We're going to start doing
Kevin.
Okay, so
Come back with specific plans. Don't talk about
Okay.
what we may be doing, what we might be doing. It's a much more productive conversation if you come to this body with specific plans as to what you're going to do. We don't need to see how the sausage is made. Give us an idea of what the plans are, not who you're talking to, what we might do. It's too wishy-washy. I need specifics. We need specifics, okay?
Okay, as a matter of fact, there's another workshop coming up where there's going to be Broadway is going to be one of the topics, so I'll get into that there. And again, Flamingo Park, we've been working with that community directly to determine what we're going to be doing. And, you know, I don't really need to go through all these details.
No,
if you
just
want me to.
penny sales tax projects update, okay? What have we spent to date? What is left to spend? What's the plan to spend it? All right? What is the timeline for getting it done? That's another thing I don't see here. I know it's on your, what's that fancy name for this chart? What's it?
Gantt. It's a Gantt chart.
Gantt.
Gantt chart.
Yeah, my wife does that stuff. Gantt chart. Okay, I know it's fancy. I never can read them. But anyway, in a simple PowerPoint presentation, so that people like me who are kind of slow can see specifically our progress to date, our plans for going forward, specific plans for going forward, okay? So maybe at some other time, we could redo this and get it a little bit more fine-tuned.
Okay. I apologize. I was,
No need to apologize. It's, just let's get it done. Commissioner Schoaf.
Thank you. And if I may, Mayor, I apologize. I should have probably done this from the beginning. It was at my request that this item was put on the agenda. And I did so because there were some questions from the public, especially confusion as the Parks Bond came in as to why projects were not in the Parks Bond. And I think my intention was to give the broader view to the public to say that there are various allocations of money, and they're used in various ways, and staff is very creative about looking to see where we can fund different aspects of projects. And I think the distinct difference was in the Parks Bond, we're given the allocation of money on the upfront to spend, whereas the penny sales tax is accumulated over time. The tax has to be collected. You heard Mr. Volberg say we've collected about 50% because we're about 5 years into this. So there's a difference in the funding mechanism, which I thought was important to point out, as well as that this is just a portion of the budget. Gaines Park is a perfect example of that, where I had residents questioning why Gaines Park got a smaller allocation than, say, Curry Park or Howard Park. And the important thing was to look at where all these allocations were coming from. I guess if it would be okay, Mayor, the main question that I wanted to address here was the prioritization of projects and the timing, and how do we make sure that there are some very major projects that are important to a lot of our districts here. And we kind of hear it as a first come, first serve. So I just want to make sure that we have some of these major projects that don't get to the end of the line and lack funding. So I think that was the major thing that I wanted to look at to say, what's our progress marker? How are we marking that progress? And how do we ensure that when we get to the end of 10 years, what we have left unfunded has some sort of plan going
Are
forward?
there
So that
specific
was my
projects
intent.
that you have in mind?
Not specific projects necessarily, Mayor, and so that may be addressed at another time. But I think what I was looking at was more of a theory of where we're funding, what we've funded so far, and if we see in the future any major shortfalls, which it sounds like we're still at a place in this process, being 50% through, that we don't see a lot of funding shortfalls. You addressed COVID and COVID's effect on this, but that may vary in the next few years as far as spending being higher or lower. So my intention was to take a look at this, see if we saw any major shortfalls. We have Pleasant City Community Center, Coleman Park Community Center, Gaines Park Community Center, a lot of really big community centers, and being very North End centric, I know all the North End projects on here, but again, lots of projects throughout the city, fire training facility, et cetera. These are the big allocations that I wanted to look and see, are we looking at shortfalls there, and do we need to be looking at our budgeting going forward to say, are there other funding sources we need to be looking at because there's going to be a major shortfall in X project?
well, I don't anticipate that there's going to be a shortfall. We're going to collect the $60 million, and we'll probably collect it before the 10 years are up. The way this is currently scheduled out, this last column here is 2024, okay? So up through 2021, this is 17, 18, 19, 20. So in 2021, we plan on spending about $11.5 million to reach the essentially $60 million of allocation and expenditures sometime by the end of 2024. That's where we're currently planned to go forward with. Now, there may be some fluctuations in that some of these projects may push out a little bit, but as far as the money that's allocated from the sales tax proceeds, most of it is specifically defined in what it's going to be used in the community centers, the neighborhoods. The only ones that are somewhat flexible is the citywide roadway improvements and the lighting improvements and the greenway multi-use path projects. And so we've tried to lay this out as methodically and as strategically as we can. There is some room for some adjustments to that, particularly since the South Dixie project is likely not going to go forward. And that money could possibly be allocated to something else. But for the most part, everything else that's laid out in here is probably going to stay just like it is.
And so let me ask the question in this way. We're 50% through this process. We're through the planning phase of a lot of our major projects. So do we see any budgetary shortfalls? We planned on spending, $5 million on Coleman Park Community Center. We're seeing it come in at $7 million, so $2 million has to come from a project somewhere else. Have we identified any of those projects that we need to look at alternative sources of funding for?
Not at this point. Obviously with Gaines Park, when we put together the concept plan on that based on what the community wanted, we realized that the $4.9 million was not going to be sufficient for that, and that's where the $3 million from the Parks Bond came in. On Howard Park, Pleasant City, we got that taken care of within the budgets that we had. And for Howard Park, and Coleman Park is still within the budget that we had for that. Howard Park, we anticipate that we're going to be able to do that for the funding we have. The current market is very volatile at the moment, but hopefully by the time that goes out to bid, things will have settled down and we'll get a decent price for that, and we'll be able to still do that within the budget. But that's still yet to be determined. But for the most part, I would say that the projects that we are allocating and identifying for the sales tax program are going to be done within the budgets that we have allocated from the sales tax proceeds.
Just one final question, Mayor, if I
Yes.
may. And Armando, this may be a question for you, as it's more financial, or it may require follow-up from Mr. Parks. As we're collecting this, you can see that we have a lot of pending projects that we haven't actually expended a lot of the money we've collected, which is understandable because we're planning projects and then in construction phase, we spend the most money. As we've collected about half of this, do we put this in some sort of interest-bearing account so that it's sitting there performing and potentially creating revenues that we could use in these projects, or how does that money get allocated financially?
Yeah, I think generally they do go into interest-bearing accounts, but as I recall, and I know the specifics of this particular bond, there are limitations on what you can
Understandable.
invest. You can't just have it sitting there
Sure.
collecting money, right?
All right, thank you.
No arbitrage. Commissioner Lambert.
Thank you, and thanks for that explanation, Mr. Volbrick. I think it's very helpful to see where we are financially, to get some answers to Commissioner Schoaf's question, and I look forward to future discussion on the unallocated roadway improvement funding, as well as the funding that was slated for South Dixie improvements. And if possible, I'd like to see some suggestions for those funds to be utilized in that same area, or to help achieve similar results. I realize that it was to be in tandem with the Florida Department of Transportation project, and so maybe our project can't be completed without theirs, but maybe there's something we can do that will still achieve somewhat of the same goals. I understand that funding was a lot for landscaping in that area and things like that. So I look forward to that future workshop, hopefully soon. Thank you.
Any other questions on this matter? Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Barber. Appreciate the presentation. Okay, under Mayor's Matters, the only thing I have is extending a big fat thank you and congratulations to Special Events and Parks and Recreation. We had a fantastic 4th on Flagler. I mean, the numbers far exceeded what I'm used to seeing there, and the fireworks show was just splendid. So kudos to your team, Leah, for what I think was just a fantastic event. It's a great way to come back in person, and it really, I think, showed off some of the best elements of West Palm Beach. I was in conversations with the team from New Day USA, and they couldn't believe what we were doing, and we're very excited now about being a member of this community because we could do things like that. So congratulations. That is all I have. Anybody else have anything good for the order? Yeah, Commissioner Lambert.
Thank you, Mayor. I realize that Administrator Johnson isn't here, but after our May joint work session with the school board, you had asked if she could report back to us on the suggestions that were made during that presentation. And some of them, actually, I wondered might be, some of them were crosswalks related and maybe covered in even the penny sales tax projects, but I was just curious if we could get an update on those requests and if they were feasible or not.
Yeah, I'll have her get back to you.
Thank you.
When she returns from vacation. Anything else? Okay, very good. Thank you, everyone. This meeting's adjourned. Thank you all.